Hello! You're watching the Great Canadian Bagel, and today we are starting a new series, the British Columbia 2024 provincial election forecast. We're a bit early about a year out here, but a lot of interesting things are going on between the BC United and Conservative Party, so I thought we would start coverage soon. And I'm also likely going to be covering more intermittent provincial matters for the future. Eventually planning on also doing Ontario and Quebec at least. New Brunswick too, because New Brunswick has an election next year. On an intermittent basis, maybe like once a quarter, once a half, depends on polls. So those are coming in the future too, but for now, we're starting with BC for this month. Now, before I get into the rest of the video, I would just once again like to shout out all of my channel members. I greatly appreciate the donations and support. It really helps me out in the channel and makes it a lot easier for me to plan the videos. And at this point, I'm happy to note I'm actually revenue positive. Now, I don't make enough money to do this as a full-time job yet. One day, hopefully I will, and then I can do even more stuff and more content and stuff like that. But at least for now, I am not spending money to do this, which was expected, and don't feel bad for me for having spent money to do this. When you start up a business, you have to spend money. But I just like to say I'm happy to report that. So thank you for all of your assistance. And if you want to help out the channel, by all means, join below as a member. And if you can't do that, you can't afford to give on a monthly donation, I understand. Perfectly reasonable. In which case, just make sure you like, share, subscribe to the video, and comment below. All of those things really help, and YouTube loves them. But no further ado, let us begin. So the first thing I'll note here is I don't have my normal graphics. There is no pre-existing fair use BC map I can use of the new districts that I could modify for myself. So I'm eventually going to make my own. I can do that. It's just a lot of more work. In the intermediate time, since I don't have that available, I'm just using Polling Canada's DUI map or DIY map here. So if you want to use it yourself, you can go to canadianpolling.ca and then you can find it there. It's a neat little tool. Eventually I'm going to use my own thing again, just because I can do a lot more stuff with it and it's more useful. But while we're using this, I'll just clarify what I'm using for the colors here, because I'm not using my normal color scheme. There's no labels. So this lightest color is less than 2 points. This is 2 to 5. This is 10 to 20. And this is 20 plus. As we can see here from the beginning, the BC NDP has already a majority in 20 plus ridings, safe ridings. So at this stage, as of October 9th, 2023, there is no doubt you can have that the BC NDP are going to win this election. Especially since, as the polling is showing, the BC NDP aren't losing votes. They're not losing ground. They're not gaining ground. They're hovering in the low mid-40s range, depending on the poll. But they're not losing ground. All the movement that's happening in the polls right now is between the BC Conservative Party and the BC United, formerly the BC Liberal Party. And there's a lot of interest between those two parties. And frankly, I think that's actually where the interest in this race is. It's not really about who's going to win the election, because we already know that. It's the NDP. They're going to win. They're going to probably win more seats, and they might even win more votes than they did in 2020. That's basically a foregone conclusion. The interesting thing here is what happens between the BC Conservative Party and BC United. The gist basically is those two parties, the BC Conservative Party has existed for ages and ages. I think it was deregistered for a bit, but it was re-registered ages ago. Because before the NDP came around, the party system in BC was the Liberals versus the Conservatives. And then the NDP came in, the BC Liberals and the Conservatives kind of merged into the So-Creds for a little bit, sort of didn't, and there's a bunch of not particularly relevant history there. The grand scheme of things, they basically just changed the name of the center-right party several times. Over the last 20, 30 years, the center-right party has been the BC Liberal Party, though it's now renamed itself the BC United Party. Now, the reason why the BC Conservatives in general have existed, and they, despite not having much electoral success, have regularly run candidates in most elections, at least in the last 20 years, is a lot of people in BC don't see the BC Liberals, or now the BC United Party, as a very conservative party. It's center-right, maybe, but not in any useful way. It doesn't really conserve things. It might be a bit fiscally conservative, but not that amazingly so. It's definitely not socially conservative. So a lot of people in BC have been discontent about this, though it hasn't really boiled anywhere yet, at least up until now. What's happening now, though, is quite interesting, and it is a perfect and fine example of why I regularly say to launch a party, you need an MLA. It's nearly impossible to get a party off the ground without an actual MLA championing it. It can happen. It has happened before. But it is incredibly hard. There's dozens and dozens of parties that are registered and deregistered over the course of decades that go nowhere. They might get 1 or 2% of the vote, but they don't go anywhere. Without an MLA in the party, they usually don't go anywhere. And that's where the BC Conservatives were for about 20 to 30 years since the Socreds died. Before the Socreds died, it's a bit more complicated, but we're not really going back that far today. If you want to know me to cover more historical details on the BC stuff, let me know in the comments below in the next BC update, whenever that happens. I will talk about that. It depends on polls. You see, I don't really want to do model updates if there's no polls out, because there's nothing to say. My commentary is informed on polls, basically. So why now? Why now do the BC Conservatives come out? Because the contestation between the BC United / Liberals and the Conservatives in BC has been a perennial issue for the party. It has not ever not been an issue. It's usually not a significant issue, but it's usually an issue. And in the past, too, we've actually had the BC Conservatives polling very high. I believe even in 2020 they were polling in 2020 they were polling at 10-20% depending on the poll until the election started. And then they couldn't field a full slate, and they ended up only doing 2%. We could only field 18 or 19 of 87 candidates. And there's still the open possibility that come 2024, they won't actually be able to field 93 candidates, in which case then this might have just been a temporary mirage. That these BC Conservative numbers aren't actually real. They'll end up going back to the BC United, and then you'll see things like Abbotsford and the Chilliwax, and a lot of these rural interior ridings like Fraser-Nicola or Kootenay Central, maybe. Stuff around Okanagan here, Kamloops, etc. Some of these ridings might go back to BC United / BC Liberals. I'm just going to refer them to BC United going forward now. They might go back to them. You could see them getting 30, 40 seat range instead of 16. Now, by no means is that guaranteed. I don't even think that is necessarily likely. Because there's a very material difference between this election and last one. First off, the last election was a snap election because John Horgan wanted to take advantage of his good polls to try to get a proper majority. So he called the election a year early. Should have been in 2021. He called it in 2020. Pretty normal politics stuff. In this time around, though, Eby has a monstrous lead in the polls. There's no reason for him to call a snap election. He might as well just wait a year. Because with the BC United and the Conservatives so divided, the odds of this being a real contested election is pretty negligible. So it's better to just wait out the whole term, get that whole extra year in, then get another 4-year term. If you call this snap election now, he loses a year of his tenure in office effectively, because generally speaking, the years in office aren't what changes or don't count against you per se. It's the number of terms someone serves, how many elections they contest. Usually, you can only win about 3 elections, maybe 4, if you're really good at campaigning. So there's no reason to go into an unnecessary election, unnecessarily shorten his term in office when his opposition is so divided. Might as well just govern the extra year. So we're not likely going to see this surprise snap election that's going to catch someone like the BC Conservatives off guard. They're going to have a whole year to collect and select candidates for all the ridings. So they're likely going to run a larger slate. And if they run a larger slate, if they run a full slate even, we are likely going to see a very strong performance from them. We have right now, model-wise here, is I have them currently at 17.4%. But I will note the BC Conservatives are currently surging in the polls. So it's not a clear 17.4%. That might be understating their performance because we don't have the most polls in the world and they're currently surging. They could be doing even better than 17% right now. You just look at the most 2 recent polls that were published, a Ledger poll on September 18th and a Research Co poll for September 19th, dates conducted, I should say. Those had the BC Conservatives at 19 and 25%, but the BC United at 20 and 19%. In a sense, almost the inverse of the numbers I currently have. But, again, that has only the 2 most recent polls. I'm not including that many polls in the model right now because I'm basically just including the polls since John Rustad was elected or acclaimed leader of the BC Conservatives. Not because the polls before then weren't likely not trustworthy, but just that that's such a huge event, that's such a big thing to go from having a third, fourth party being basically irrelevant, a footnote, and it having elected MLAs in office. That's so big. That's a huge change. And there's not that many polls anyways, so it's not really that big of a deal. I'm only excluding basically 4 polls because the polls from before Ebbie became NDP leader in 2022 are also kind of suspect too because it's a different leader, a different candidate, everything is different. So we have part of the reason why this is likely different for the BC Conservatives, and that they're likely going to have a full slate. But it's also different that they have 2 elected MLAs. Now, they weren't elected as the BC Conservatives. They crossed the floor. We have Chaco Lake's incumbent, John Rustad, who's walked across the floor and is now in the BC Conservatives. And then we have Abbotsford's South MLA, Bruce Banman, who's also done this, giving him 2 elected MLAs. In context, for reference here, they're second place BC Conservatives in Abbotsford South. They could reasonably win that riding if their polling is correct. In fact, the whole Fraser Valley is in contention for the BC Conservative Party if their polling is correct. Now, again, my model's currently possibly underestimating them. Though it's very hard to hit a moving target like a brand new party that's surging out of nowhere, basically. And there's even more reason to think that these polls are accurate. We had a series of by-elections on June 24th. Man, I can't even read. 2023. One in Vancouver, Mount Pleasant by-election. There, the BC Conservatives only got 5%. Not huge, but they've also never run a candidate in that riding. I mean, it's only existed for 2 elections potentially, so you could argue that, but Usually deep Vancouver is not really friendly to more conservative parties. So that's also quite a surprise. Now, again, maybe we can discount that. Maybe it's not that interesting because it's only 5%. Okay. I mean, you're probably not wrong. Probably isn't worth noting that much. But the one that is worth noting quite a bit was the by-election in Langford Juan de Fuca. Pronunciation? Not sure. In that election, in a Victoria suburb, the Conservatives got 20%. They came in second place. Not only did they run a candidate there get 20% when they never ran one before, but that 20% represents a second place finish when the BC United candidate also got 9%. In the 2020 general election, the BC Liberals / United only got 15% total. So the BC United, BC Conservative grouping got 29% in the by-election, but they only got 15% in the general. Now, that is not to say they will get 29% in the next election. There's no good reason to think that would be the case. But there's also no reason to think that won't be the case. And that is a very strong piece of evidence right there, that there is something material to this. A brand new party doesn't just get 20% placements in ridings that are not normally friendly to that riding, to that brand. You wouldn't expect Juan de Fuca Malahat down here to elect a Conservative. You wouldn't expect that. That makes it materially more interesting than, say, the Manitoba election recently, where the Keystone Party in some rural ridings got like 20, 30%. That's not that interesting because you would expect a more conservative party like the Keystone Party, or at least attempting to be more conservative, to do well in very rural areas. You would expect that. That makes sense. You would not expect Malahat Juan de Fuca Langford area. I mean, this is the new riding, the old riding, so it's slightly different. But you wouldn't expect this riding to go strongly or to have a strong conservative presence in it, because federally and provincially, it's not. It's usually a safe NDP riding. Maybe occasionally the Greens have posted a challenge, but not usually. So you wouldn't expect that. That makes itself surprising already. So we have a couple surprising by-elections. We have some strong polls. We've had 2 MLAs cross the floor. There's suggestion, based off of people, some of the behavior of MLAs in the legislature, who did not applaud with the rest of the BC United Caucus against or with Ebby when he was rebuking one of John Rutsad's questions in question period. There was 3 or 4 MLAs who didn't clap with the rest of the caucus. And there's suggestions from people like Bruce Banman that other members of the caucus are thinking about leaving, crossing the floor as well. If you start seeing 2 or 3 or 4 more MLAs cross the floor to 6 MLAs for the BC Conservatives, and the polling keeps going as is, they will have a huge amount of momentum behind them. Now, it's not certain yet what will happen as a result of this momentum and what will come as a result of this. I can't easily predict which ridings they're going to do well in, other than some of the obvious ones, like some of these interior BC ridings they're going to be strong in. Naturally. Fraser Valley, they seem to be doing well. I can't tell you exactly where all these are going to be, but it is likely the case that they might gain more ground. Now, this might make you think, it might make you wonder here, Why? What happened? Why did John Rustad join the BC Conservatives? Why are the BC United just floundering so hard? Now, a lot of people, a lot of my peers who do things like this, if you like are on Twitter and political Twitter and stuff like that, have advanced the theory that the reason why the BC United Party is dying right now is because they changed their name from the BC Liberals and it's a branding disaster. I don't think that's accurate. I don't even think it's partially explanatory. Yes, about 1/3 of voters polled don't know the BC United was formerly the BC Liberal Party. But usually about 1/3 to 2/5 of the population don't vote anyways. So that doesn't really tell you anything. Now you could argue that the people who don't vote are probably not going to answer a poll. So that 1/3 is actually representing some people who do vote. Okay, sure, I'll allow that critique. But then you have the other follow-up comment on that is a lot of people who do vote also don't pay attention outside of campaigns. They have their life to worry about. They have things to do. They can't just sit here and worry about the name of political parties. So I don't think that really tells you that much. Maybe it's hurt them a little bit, but I don't think that's the reason why they're going down. Because if we look at before this whole shtick occurred, in fall 2022, BC Liberals were polling around 35%. Now you look at a year later, fall 2023, they're polling around 20%. That means they have lost 43% of their vote, but 2/3 of the voters are aware they changed their name. That's already a 10-point discrepancy there. And I would argue it's even more because, again, some of the people who are polled don't actually vote. That's bound to happen. So it's likely an even larger discrepancy. And then you still have the thing where just because you don't know who the BC United Party, like maybe you think the BC Liberals are gone, that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to vote for the BC Conservatives now. And again, the BC Conservatives basically didn't exist before. So I don't think the name change is a meaningful reason why they're dying. Now, I think it was a pointless decision. I don't think it did anything for them. It might have done some damage because losing branding is an issue. Branding matters. But I don't think it's the main issue or even close to the main issue. No, I think what is more likely, at least to me, is the BC United Party did this to themselves. Kevin Falcon, in his desire to appear moderate and safe, I guess trying to appeal to urban Vancouver, booted out John Rustad from the party because John Rustad made some comments pushing back against liberal talking points on climate change. Now, maybe he's wrong. Maybe he was right. I don't know. I haven't looked at his comments in enough detail, and I don't really care because it doesn't actually matter what he said. What matters is Kevin Falcon kicked him out of the party. And what he said seemed to resonate with a lot of conservative-leaning people. Which makes sense, because people want an opposition who opposes things. They don't want an opposition who just holds hands with the current government, or else they would vote for the current government. So if he was kicked out of, since he was kicked out of the party for opposing the government, that already sets up the BC United in a bad position. That means they're kicking out somebody in their party for opposing the government, something their voters want them to do, because if their voters didn't want them to oppose the government, they would have voted for that party. Parliamentary democracy is not about holding hands and being friends. It's about trying to get the correct ideas done. What are the correct ideas, you might ask yourselves? Depends on the person who asks. That's why we have elections, because no one can tell you what the correct ideas are, because everyone's ideas on what is correct is different. Even among conservative-leaning people, there's big disagreements on what is the appropriate trade policy or the appropriate fiscal policy. How much taxes do we cut? Is a very common disagreement in more conservative people for fiscal reasons, for fiscal issues. Or another really common one on social conservatives is, what is a good first step on abortion? That is a big question a lot of social conservatives ask, and there's a big open debate in that in social conservative circles. There's no clear answer to that. There's no definitive answer. That's what elections are. That's what politics is. So when people see parties that don't oppose the government, they're going to be soured about them. So that's already step one where Falcon made a big mistake. He got rid of an MP or an MLA who was actively opposing the government, something his base wanted. And also by booting out John Rustad, you basically put John Rustad in the position where if he runs as an independent in a parliamentary democracy, he's probably going to lose. Independents almost never win. So Falcon has put Rustad in a do or die position. Either he just accepts that he's going to lose re-election and retires, or he throws it into a gamble, takes over the BC Conservative Party, and tries to win with the BC Conservative Party to preserve his own head in politics. The incentives are now in that there is no loss for Rustad. He's in a no-lose position. There's no downsides to trying. What happens if he fails? Okay, he loses. Re-election, great. He was going to lose anyways. Independents don't win. So we have that issue come in. And that's already bad. Because as soon as you put an elected MLA in a party, that party gets media attention. It gets talking time in the legislature. The person becomes known, becomes relevant. People know who John Rustad is now. No one knew who he was in 2022. He was like just another MLA. Maybe people in BC might have heard about him, but the average person wouldn't have, especially no one outside of BC. And now plenty of people outside of BC are going to hear about him because there's many of you who aren't in BC who are going to watch this video. And now you know about John Rustad. This media attention and this notoriety given by taking over a small party brings oxygen to that party by alerting people that this party exists and it's serious. There's an MLA attached to it. There's an elected representative in this party. He wants to win. No elected representative wants to lose. And what this does is it brings volunteers, it brings donations, it brings people who want to join the party too. Because you have people who are ideologically conservative who see a contest or an opposition to the BC United Party, which they don't think is ideologically conservative, and they see a real threat, a real challenger. So they donate money to it. They spend resources on it. They help it. That turns it from a niche D-tier party to a serious threat. We already saw this in Quebec in 2022 when Claire Simpson, I think that's her name, or correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, I didn't have notes up for this, but she joined the Parti de Conservateur Québécois, pronunciation? Yeah, my French is not great. And that brought that party from being mostly irrelevant to being a very notorious party. It became a relevant party by that crossing the floor. Now, it did also help that they ended up picking up a well-known, well-liked talk radio host in Eric Doom to lead the party. That definitely helped them. But both of those things matter a lot. Having famous individuals join a party, having MLAs join a party, matters a lot. In the grand scheme of things, you might not like this, you might be sad about this, but it is what it is. In society, you do not go anywhere. You cannot succeed in any mission you want to do. You are going and are bound to fail unless somebody in the upper class champions your issue from the upper class. The upper class needs to be involved in anything that wants to succeed. And in Canada, in democracies like Canada, MLAs are the upper class, because class structure, which you really need to understand, it's not about money, it's about power. Influence. Sorry about that. The Eric Duham, I'm not sure how much money he actually has as a person, or his background as a person, but as a influential, famous talk radio host near Quebec City, is one of the members you could reasonably contend is upper class politically. He has influence, he has name recognition, he has power. His talk radio show is listened to by a lot of people. Or was. I don't think he has a talk radio show anymore. Not sure. In the case of John Rustad, as an elected MLA, he has voice, he has influence, he has notoriety, he has power. By doing something like joining the Conservative Party, it brings all that to the Conservative Party. It becomes a serious thing. It also brings someone who actually knows how to win elections to it, because he's won elections. Maybe he's not a genius at winning elections, but he's done it. And that's a big deal, as we saw in Manitoba recently. When you have a party who doesn't know how to win elections, you get what happens to the BC or the Manitoba PC party. They get destroyed because they don't know what they're doing. But all of this was made even worse when Bruce Banneman crossed the floor. Because now not only do you have the crossing of the floor of John Rustad, who had nothing to lose by doing it, because he was going to lose re-election anyways. So the worst case scenario is he loses re-election in blue instead of losing it in gray. Big deal. Bruce Banneman crossing the floor, the Abbotsford South MLA, changes the arithmetic entirely. This brings it from someone in the upper class who has nothing to lose championing a cause to someone who has no reason to do this crossing the floor. That means they believe in it. That they have no faith in Kevin Falcon. Right now, we see here, Abbotsford South, the NDP only has a 1% lead. The BC United and BC Conservatives collectively have like 50% there. Bruce Banneman likely could be winning re-election perfectly fine if he stayed as BC United. There would be probably very little contestation there. By joining the BC Conservative Party, he actually jeopardizes himself. He's put himself in a position where he could lose re-election now, where he likely wouldn't have lost it before. That matters. People putting themselves at risk of losing their position, their influence, their power for a cause brings influence to that cause. And if we start seeing more MLAs cross the floor, we see more strong polls for the BC Conservatives, this is only going to get worse for the BC United Party. And in fact, I'm willing to stake right now, October 9th, 2023, that if the BC Conservative Party can win one seat in the Lower Mainland, and for me, the Lower Mainland is like Maple Ridge, Fraser Valley, and Vancouver area. If they can win one seat there, that wasn't from an MP crossing the floor, they can win one new MLA there, just one, the BC United Party is going to die. Maybe it will merge with the BC Conservative Party, but it won't be an equal merge. It won't be akin to the United Conservative Party in BC, whereas like, to at least my outside perspective, correct me if I'm wrong, Albertans, it looked pretty 50-50, at least initially. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be closer to the Reform and Federal PC Party merger, where it was mostly just the Reform Party annexing the PCs. That's likely is what's going to happen in BC if the BC Conservatives win one seat in the Lower Mainland that they did not already control. One seat. The reason why I say one seat is the critical factor in this next election, and it's the thing to watch for. Everything else is not as interesting. If the BC Conservatives can win one net new seat in the Lower Mainland, they're probably going to they're probably going to absorb the BC United, not the other way around, is because that will mean the BC Conservative Party is not a liability in urban areas. Because in reality, in BC, roughly like half or like 2/3 of the seats are in urban. Actually, we could get a good list of this, count of this. Oops, that's the wrong thing to do. Good seat trend here. So if we look at the Fraser Valley and Vancouver itself, 53 seats. So 53 of 93 seats are in these two regions. So it's physically impossible to win an election in BC without winning seats here. And unless the BC Conservatives / United want to win literally every seat on Vancouver Island in the interior, they need to win a lot of seats here. They probably need to win like 10 to 20 range to form a government. And again, currently they are looking at what? 5? Last election they got 10. And last election there's actually fewer seats in the region too. So going from 10 to 5 is more than just losing 5 seats. It's actually a lower percentage as well. It's more than just half. It's like losing 2/3 of your seats or something like that. So that's where this is going to be interesting. Can the BC Conservatives gain enough momentum to win a seat in the Lower Mainland? If they can't, and you see the BC Conservatives just stuck to the interior of BC, maybe rural Vancouver Island too, because North Island here is they're in second place, like 3 points down. So they're pretty close there. But if you see them stuck in this area, and they're shut out of the main urban area of BC, what we will likely see is some kind of 50-50 merger, or maybe some electoral coalition where the BC Liberals don't run, or United doesn't run anyone in interior ridings, and the BC Conservatives don't run anyone in the urban ridings. And then once they somehow eventually win power, they get like an electoral reform or something like PR. That could happen. But what is more, and that's likely going to happen, or that will likely be the result if BC Conservatives can't win seats in the Lower Mainland. Now, the BC Conservatives probably have 1 or 2 elections to try this, because I'm pretty sure, barring like a really early merger or complete collapse of one of these two parties, Ebi probably should win 2028 as well. If there's the vote split on the right, it's going to be basically impossible for the right to beat the NDP. A lot of these seats are 20-point leads, not because the NDP has amazing vote totals in them. For example, Abbotsford's West here is like a 20-point lead, not because the NDP are doing amazing. They're only like 45%. They're about average there. But their opposition is like 46 or 47% or something like that. But it's split. We'll see how this goes. But that's the thing to look out here in this BC election. It's really the interplay between the BC United and the BC Conservative Party. In a sense, it's kind of like the Quebec election in 2022. That wasn't really an election about who's going to win the election. It was an election about who is going to become the main animus of opposition. to the CAQ? Who is going to take the antagonist role in the growing party system there? Same thing is occurring seemingly in BC. And it is down to see where this will go. Now, historically, insurgent parties like the BC Conservatives only have in Canada, they don't have a great track record. It's mixed. We saw the Reform Party destroy the PCs, but the NDP failed to beat the Liberals. At least for decades and decades and decades. So where this goes remains to be seen, but that's why you should stay tuned to this series as I do it. I'm not sure when the next video is going to be. We're going to see. Going to try to aim for at least once per quarter for this until the polling picks up closer to the election day, but we'll see. Well, with that, I bid you all adieu, and I will see you next week with something new.